20 seconds after the confrontation began, the men who had arrived with certainty were no longer speaking. No blows were exchanged in front of the room. No one raised their voice. Those watching would later struggle to describe what changed, only that it did. Bruce Lee did not leave the area immediately. Neither did the boxing champion beside him. But the space around them subtly cleared, as if an unspoken agreement had been reached. What ended the moment was not force, but recognition, and it happened faster than anyone expected. Backstage areas are not designed for drama. They exist to manage transition, not attention. After a major boxing event, they become narrow corridors of movement where people wait, pass through, or pause briefly before returning to public view. The noise of the arena does not disappear completely, but it dulls into a low, distant presence, like sound heard through a wall. What remains is routine. That night the corridor was doing what it always did. Corners were occupied by equipment cases. Folding chairs lined the wall without order. A few staff members moved with practiced familiarity, carrying towels, paperwork, or nothing at all. Conversations were brief and functional. No one lingered without reason. Bruce Lee stood within this space without attempting to shape it. He was not positioned at the center of the room, nor did he lean against anything that suggested ownership. Those who noticed him later would say that he seemed to occupy exactly the amount of space required, no more. He was dressed simply, without the markers of performance or ceremony. Nothing about his appearance announced authority, yet nothing about it invited interruption. Nearby stood the boxing champion. His presence was more immediately recognizable to the environment. People adjusted slightly as they passed him, stepping wider, lowering their voices. Years of public recognition had trained others to respond before thinking. But even so, the champion did not command the space. He waited in it. The two men were not engaged in conversation. They did not appear to be preparing for anything. To observers, this was important. There was no visible alliance being formed, no strategic discussion underway. They shared proximity, not intention. Whatever awareness existed between them was quiet and unexpressed. Witnesses later remarked on the stillness, not an exaggerated stillness, but the kind that emerges when someone is fully present without performing that presence. Bruce Lee's posture did not shift often. His gaze moved sparingly, taking in entrances, exits, and the rhythm of people passing through. He was not watching for trouble. He was simply aware. Backstage environments tend to reveal hierarchy quickly. Those who belong move without hesitation. Those who do not hesitate without moving. On this night, Bruce Lee belonged without credentials. No one asked who he was or why he was there. No one directed him elsewhere. The space accepted him without discussion. This context mattered later, when people tried to explain what followed, because nothing in the environment suggested a confrontation was possible, much less imminent. There were no raised voices, no tightening of security, no shift in body language that would signal escalation. The corridor remained what it had been minutes earlier, a place of passage, not conflict. And yet, within this unremarkable setting, something was about to test the quiet balance of authority that had gone unchallenged until it was. Authority does not always arrive with movement. In some spaces, it settles first, almost unnoticed, and reveals itself only when something presses against it. That night, Bruce Lee's presence functioned this way. He did not scan the room with suspicion or track people as they passed. His attention was broad rather than fixed, resting on the environment instead of any individual within it. Those nearby would later say that he seemed available but not open. There was no tension in his shoulders, no defensive posture. His hands were relaxed, neither concealed nor displayed. He did not lean forward in anticipation, nor withdraw as a precaution. The posture suggested someone who had already measured the space and found nothing requiring adjustment. The boxing champion beside him carried a different kind of recognition. His authority had been earned publicly, reinforced by cameras, titles, and repeated validation. People knew what he represented because they had been told many times by headlines and commentary. Yet even with that familiarity, his demeanor remained restrained. He did not engage with those passing by, nor did he signal for attention. Like Bruce Lee, he waited. What connected the two men was not conversation, but alignment. They stood at similar angles, their positions complementary without appearing coordinated. Neither mirrored the other deliberately, but the effect was of two individuals comfortable with their own boundaries. This was not solidarity expressed outwardly. It was compatibility recognized inwardly. Witnesses noticed the absence of preparation. There was no stretching, no rehearsal of movement, no tightening of fists. Bruce Lee did not adjust his clothing or shift his stance as though anticipating conflict. His stillness carried a specific quality, not relaxation, but readiness without intent. To those unfamiliar with it, this distinction went unnoticed. To those who recognized it, it registered immediately. Backstage corridors encourage proximity, but they rarely encourage challenge. People move through them with goals already defined. That is why the lack of reaction stood out. Bruce Lee did not react to being recognized nor to being ignored. Both outcomes seemed equally acceptable to him. Several individuals passed within arm's length without acknowledgement. Others slowed slightly, uncertain whether to speak. No invitation was extended, and none was required. Bruce Lee's presence did not draw attention, it filtered it. Those unsure of their place moved on. Those confident did the same. The boxing champion later described the moment as uneventful. Not dismissively, but precisely. Nothing had happened yet. And yet, something had been established. The environment had quietly sorted itself. Lines had formed without being drawn. This unannounced authority created a condition, one that would soon be tested, not by accident, but by intention. Pressure rarely announces itself with noise. In enclosed spaces, it arrives through intent. The shift that occurred in the corridor was subtle enough that many did not register it immediately. A pause in movement, a hesitation at the far end, conversations tapering off without being consciously ended. 8 men entered together, not shoulder to shoulder, but close enough to suggest coordination. They did not rush. Their pace was deliberate, practiced. Each of them had learned how to move through controlled environments without drawing immediate attention. Their clothing was unremarkable, chosen to blend rather than impress. Nothing about them suggested public authority. Everything about them suggested private certainty. They did not speak as they approached. Their eyes moved first, scanning faces, positions, exits. They were not searching for chaos. They were assessing compliance. This was important. They expected the space to adjust around them, as it often did elsewhere. People nearby responded instinctively. A step backward, a subtle clearing of the corridor. Not out of fear, but habit. Many environments teach this response. The enforcers had entered countless rooms where their arrival alone restructured behavior. This corridor at first appeared no different. Bruce Lee did not shift. He did not turn to face them fully, nor did he look away. His posture remained unchanged, his weight balanced without visible intention. If he noticed their arrival, there was no outward acknowledgement. The boxing champion remained beside him, equally still. This absence of reaction created friction. The enforcers slowed as they drew closer. They were used to acknowledge, direct or indirect, a glance, a pause, a calculation. What they encountered instead was neutrality, not defiance, not submission, simply the continuation of what had already been there. One of the men adjusted his path slightly, angling toward Bruce Lee. This was not an act of aggression, but of testing. Proximity is often enough to provoke a response. It allows dominance to be established without words. The expectation was simple. The space would yield. It did not. The corridor held its shape. Bruce Lee's position remained unchanged, not because he resisted, but because he had nowhere else to be. The stillness forced a recalculation. The men were close enough now to recognize details, breathing, balance, attention. These are things those accustomed to confrontation learn to read. Witnesses later described a moment of quiet confusion, not dramatic, not threatening, just uncertain. The usual sequence had been interrupted. The room had not reorganized itself as expected. The pressure remained unresolved, and in that unresolved space, the conditions for demonstration were set, without anyone having yet decided to demonstrate anything. What followed did not resemble what most people would later imagine. There was no clear beginning, no signal that something was about to occur. Those closest could not point to a single action and say that was when it started. It unfolded instead as a correction, small, precise, and final. One of the enforcers stepped closer, closing a distance that had remained neutral until then. It was not a lunge, it was not hostile. It was the kind of movement meant to test response time, to claim space by occupying it. In many environments, this alone would have been sufficient. Bruce Lee adjusted by a fraction. Not backward, not forward. The shift was lateral, barely perceptible. His feet did not scrape the floor. His posture did not rise or collapse. To an untrained observer, it might have looked like nothing at all, but those who understood movement would later agree that everything had changed in that instant. There was no strike, no visible technique. What occurred was positioning. Bruce Lee's body aligned in such a way that the approach lost its meaning. The angle was wrong, the leverage disappeared. The enforcer's forward certainty met a space that no longer accommodated it. Hands came up briefly, not to threaten but to clarify. A light contact at the forearm, pressure applied and released before it could register as force. The gesture was instructional rather than corrective. It communicated limits without imposing consequence. The enforcer stopped, not because he had been restrained, but because continuation no longer made sense. The path he had intended to take was no longer available. His balance had not been broken, but his expectation had been. Around them, time compressed. Witnesses would later struggle to explain how quickly the room settled. No one raised their voice. No one intervened. The corridor seemed to exhale, as though a question had been asked and answered without requiring explanation. Bruce Lee did not pursue the moment. He did not follow the adjustment with a second action. He did not maintain contact. Once the correction had been made, he returned to stillness. The demonstration was complete because it did not seek completion. The enforcers stood in place, reassessing. What they had encountered was not resistance, but clarity, the kind that removes options rather than confronts them. There was no opponent to challenge, no sequence to escalate. The boxing champion remained beside Bruce Lee throughout, unchanged. He did not step in, he did not step away. His presence reinforced what had just occurred, that nothing further was required. In under 20 seconds, the pressure that had entered the corridor dissolved. Not through force, but through understanding. And once understood, it could not be ignored. The shift did not announce itself with retreat. No one turned abruptly. No one issued instructions. The men who had entered with certainty remained where they were, but something essential had left them. Their posture changed first. Shoulders lowered, weight redistributed. The kind of readiness that depends on assumption quietly withdrew. What had collapsed was not confidence, but narrative. They had arrived with a story already formed. Numbers would establish control, proximity would secure it, and compliance would follow. That story no longer applied. The environment had refused to participate. One of the enforcers glanced toward the others. It was brief, involuntary, a search for confirmation that had always been there before. None came. Each man had registered the same interruption, and each understood that reacting outwardly would only expose it further. Bruce Lee did not maintain eye contact. He did not watch them for reaction. His attention returned to the room as a whole, as though the moment had already passed. This withdrawal of focus carried weight. It signaled that nothing further was expected from them. The corridor resumed its rhythm slowly. Staff members began to move again. Conversations restarted at lower volume. The space reclaimed its original function. This normalization made the retreat unavoidable. Remaining would now require justification, and none existed. The enforcers stepped back not as a group but individually. Each movement was small, unremarkable, yet together they formed a clear decision. The approach had failed. There was nothing left to assert. Witnesses later described the departure as quiet, not defeated but diminished. The men did not leave with urgency, they left with recognition. The understanding that whatever authority they had brought into the corridor did not extend here. Bruce Lee remained where he was. He did not watch them go. He did not mark the outcome. The absence of acknowledgement was complete. The interaction had ended the moment it had been resolved. What lingered was not tension but silence, the kind that follows clarity rather than conflict. Those present sensed that they had seen something precise, something rare, and something that would not be repeated in the same way. The lesson, though unspoken, had been delivered. In the years that followed, the incident was not often recounted in public. There were no interviews dedicated to it, no official retellings meant to fix it into a single version. When it surfaced, it did so indirectly, through quiet conversations, passing references, and moments when someone would pause before saying, "I was there." What endured was not the sequence of actions. Those details blurred quickly, as they often do when nothing overt occurs. What remained intact was the feeling of the shift, the recognition that something decisive had taken place without spectacle, and that it had altered the behavior of everyone who witnessed it. Those who spoke of it years later rarely used Bruce Lee's name at first. They spoke instead about the corridor, about how normal it had been, about how nothing in the environment suggested significance until after it had passed. This framing mattered. It preserved the integrity of the moment. It kept it from becoming a performance. For some, the memory changed how they understood authority, not as something that announces itself, but as something that reveals itself only when tested. The men who had entered with expectation left with a recalibrated sense of measure. They did not speak of loss, they spoke of boundaries. Bruce Lee continued his work elsewhere, unchanged by the incident. There was no visible effort to integrate it into his public image. If anything, it aligned with a pattern already present: restraint, efficiency, and an unwillingness to turn correction into conquest. The boxing champion, when asked years later about that night, dismissed it gently. He did not deny it. He did not elaborate. His response suggested that the outcome had been inevitable from the moment the conditions were set. Over time, the story took on the shape of instruction, not because it was retold often, but because those who understood it carried it forward in their own conduct. The lesson was not about winning, it was about removing the need to, and so the moment endured not as an event but as a reference point. A quiet reminder that the most lasting demonstrations are the ones that leave nothing to argue with and no reason to return.